Thank you, Lisette, and hello to everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, great day. I am joining you. Let me rewind to remind everyone that my name is Masharika Prejean Maddison. I use she, her pronouns, and I am coming to you today from unceded Ohlone land, San Francisco, California. A quick audio description of myself today. I have caramel brown skin. I am wearing glasses to support my vision. It's a chilly day here. I have a gray hooded sweatshirt on, and I am blessed to be sitting in front of a wall that encompasses a picture of a group of young Black identifying, or Black presenting, I should say, boys dressed in their Sunday best while sitting upon a car. I would say the time period is the 1940s, and the photo was taken in Chicago on a cold day. Um, you might hear some children in the background because during these pandemic times, we are all learning and growing together in the same space. That concludes my audio description and a bit about me. And I am so thrilled to be here with Nomy and with Lettie to learn more about Sins Invalid today. I'll turn it over perhaps to Lettie first to introduce yourself, and then followed by Nomy.
Hello, everyone. It's good to have y'all. My name's Lettie Robles-Tovar. I use they, he pronouns, and I'm the Administrative and Development Associate for Sins Invalid. I am currently on Yukut land in rural California. A brief audio description of myself. I'm a light-skinned individual from the Latin America diaspora. I have long waist-length wavy hair, dark blue glasses, and I'm wearing a orange flowy dress today.
Hi, I'm Nomy. I use she or they pronouns. I'm on Squaxin, Nisqually, Chehalis land in so-called Olympia, Washington. And I'm the creative director of Sins Invalid. And a visual description of myself, I'm a fat, white, non-binary femme person with kind of pinkish toned skin and dark, kind of shaggy, wavy hair. And I'm wearing a black dress that has kind of like the cold shoulder look, and then a jean vest and a kind of sparkly scarf. And on the jean vest, you can see a pin of a unicorn and some patches that say "We will outlive them." And I'm against a beige background.
Thank you again so much for joining us today, Nomy and Lettie. And this conversation is one that it has been building over time, really, because every conversation we've had very much influences the one in the present. So thank you all for being here to continue to grow our understanding of anti-racism in the arts. Let's start at the beginning. How about a creation story? Would love to hear in your own words, what is the creation story of Sins Invalid?
Yeah, I can take that one. I've been with the organization since 2007, I believe. But it began before I was there. And so the creation story is that Patty Byrne and Leroy Moore were friends and comrades, and each doing work around disability. And Patty's work, they were doing work around eugenics, and Leroy was doing work around police violence. And so both very much kind of in a model of having to be constantly addressing trauma and the right to even exist. And there was an initiative, I might mix up some of the details, but there was some funding that was becoming available for disability related work. And they, along with 2 other co-founders, Todd Herman and Amanda Kosler, were brainstorming, like, what would we want to do if we could just do anything? Like, they were like, we want something that reflects the wholeness of disabled people. And so they're like, let's do a performance that is about disability and sexuality. So the first Sins Invalid performance was in 2006 and was going to be a one-time event that was featuring disabled people and predominantly disabled people of color and queer and trans and non-binary disabled people. I think it was framed as gender nonconforming, doing work about sexuality. And the response, both in terms of people that wanted to be involved and then people that were so hungry for that work, it was so huge. Like, everyone was like, okay, what's happening next year? Like, can I be in it? And so they're like, oh, I guess we should do this again. And so from that, they formed an organization. Sins started out just as a performance project, but over time branched into movement building work and a lot of thought leadership around, I mean, the framework of disability justice came out of conversations that were being had between Patty and other folks at that time. And yeah, now it's however many years later, almost, I guess, 15 years. Yeah.
Wow, what an amazing creation story. And to know that it evolved out of this question of what would we do if we could do anything? Giving yourselves permission to ask that question and then answer it so fully. I'm just sitting in the beauty of that for a moment. And how did you each find your way to Sins Invalid? So Nomy, you mentioned that you've been around since 2007. Lettie would love to hear how you found your way to Sins Invalid, or how Sins Invalid found its way to you, whichever direction makes the most sense. Would love to hear from the both of you.
Yeah, so I'm unlike Nomi, I'm actually the newest staff member at Sins Invalid. So I came to Sins Invalid in about the middle of 2020. And so it kind of feels serendipitous, like it was meant to be. So a staff position opened up at Sins Invalid, and one of my long-term best friends kind of thought of me when they were looking for someone to support the organization, because in the middle of a pandemic, it's kind of a little hard to find people who have the capacity to get into the work really quickly, I suppose. So earlier in the year, I'd lost my job, so I'd just kind of been looking for employment, and it was very difficult to find employment in the middle of a pandemic. And so when the conversation came up about finding someone, she thought of me, and Sins Invalid welcomed me in wholeheartedly. And in the past, I've been involved with primarily queer and trans organizations that don't center disability. And so when I made my way into the Sins Invalid team, it kind of felt like I'd found a place where I could really cultivate my work and my identity.
Lettie has been such an amazing joy to work with. So glad that you're on the team. In 2006, I was living with my mom and applying for disability and preparing to move to the Bay Area. And Leroy Moore, who is one of the co-founders, read something that I'd written and reached out to me and was like, oh my God, I love your politics. Like, you should submit something to Sins Invalid. And I don't know how many people watching have ever gone through the process of applying for disability, but you basically can't do any work. And I do a lot of work. So I was in this place of like really trying to like pull everything in and being like, all I do is be this disabled person applying for disability. And so I was like, oh, I can't really do that right now. But I'd love to meet you when I move to the Bay. And so like pretty soon after I moved to the Bay, Leroy reached out and we like met up and talked about performance and disability. And I really hadn't had a lot of opportunity. I'd had like specific relationships with a couple like queer disabled folks, but I had not been in a full like disabled community. So I was just starting to absorb some of that world. And Leroy was really supportive and then reached out. I think it was for the 2007 show, was like, you should volunteer in the lobby selling tickets at the show. So that was my first involvement with Sins, and I met Patty there. And then the next year, and this kind of speaks to just how relational Sins Invalid is and the way it develops and grows. It was like, the next year, Patty reached out like, hey, do you want to hang out? I'd love to get to know you. And I went over and hung out with Patty at their house. And then by the end of that conversation, they were like, do you want to be in the 2008 show? And so then after that, I became involved. There was, it was called the Artistic Core. That was kind of like an advisory board that I was on for a couple years. And then I was like ongoing performing. And then a few years after that came on as staff and have been working as staff in various capacities for, I don't know, 8 years or so now. Yeah.
I feel like there's a need to say congratulations to you both, whether it's been a matter of months or a matter of years that you've been with the community. And for those who are primarily listening in, you might not be able to pick up on the smiles that Nomy and Lettie are sharing as they're sharing their respective stories. There just seems to be this level of joy, or maybe it's contentment, or it's something that is coming through and through as I'm listening to you. And I want to acknowledge it here as well so that others can also pick up on it. And I'm not sure that I knew this about you beforehand, either of you, but what I heard was that coming to Sins Invalid was the first time that you were working in a community that identified explicitly with being disabled and really being inclusive in how you define that. And I'd love to talk a bit more about this, how becoming a part of the Sins Invalid community not only shaped your understandings of ableism, but also how being a part of this community shaped your understandings of racism and anti-Blackness in their individual and combined nature. There's a way that Sins Invalid helps to clarify each of these areas, and would love to hear from you all, how your understandings of these notions have been shaped over time through Sins Invalid.
Yeah, so I've been disabled for all my life, but I never identified as disabled before I came to Sins Invalid. I think the way that disability is broadly framed, it's not framed as like an identity. And so it's not something you really identify as, or you're a part of it, that's a part of you. It's like society kind of makes it something that you don't want to identify with, because you being disabled is very, very hard thing to be in an ableist society. And so coming to Sins has kind of expanded my own identity and how I connect with my disability and how I understand how it impacts my life as a disabled person of color. It's helped me see that the interrelations between like heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism, like all of these things have co-created ableism. And all of these things rely on creating a group that is other. And like I like for a large part of my life, I felt as an other, and I wasn't able to kind of consolidate my identity into one whole being. And so I existed as a fragmented self. Like I could be Latine, but I couldn't be disabled. I could be queer and trans, but within the queer and trans spaces, being a person of color wasn't something that was really taken into account, like that intersection of being like person of color, but also being trans, and like how that manifests, and like the specific oppressions that manifest with that. So Sins Invalid, as I mentioned when I just talked about like coming into the space, it's allowed me to kind of recognize myself as a whole individual and embrace every single part of my identity without needing to fragment myself to make myself more palatable, so to speak, to general society.
I just noticed that the ASL maybe cut out. Do we need to hold on for a moment?
Thank you for acknowledging. I'm noticing this as well, and I do believe we should hold for a moment.
Okay.
And we're back.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the things that come to mind, like Lettie said, disabled identity can be a hard thing to come into. And for me, I have a physical disability since birth. And so it was always very much a part of my identity, but not necessarily a politicized one. And there was some pretty extreme trauma in my like early life that was very isolating, and that when I would be in spaces with other disabled people, it would remind me of those experiences of like hospitalization and stuff. And so coming into a space with people who, you know, I had done most of my work in like queer community, and coming into a space with folks who were queer, who were people of color, and who were disabled, and really like showing up so fully in their wholeness. I was like, there was like a vibration in my body from that was like, oh, this is the place where I need to be. Okay, I'm here now. And you know, I think with that kind of fragmentation that Lettie was talking about, like sometimes it's hard to believe that that is even possible. And I hear that reflected over and over by people who experience Sins Invalid, like, oh, all the pieces are together here. And not to, you know, idealize it. There's definitely like problems and issues, and, you know, it's life. But the opportunity to be in our wholeness. And then within that also, you know, as a white Jewish person, you know, there's ways that I've been entitled to take up space, act out, that are in some ways really influenced by trauma. And I see that in a lot of white disabled people and white disabled culture, where there's like the trauma of ableism. Like people will get like really angry and be like, I deserve this. And the act of taking up space like that in the context of disabled people of color, there's like this contrast that can often happen where it's like, yeah, where it's just white disabled people have a lot to learn, including myself, about how to like be in community in a way that's that also holds the responsibility for our own power. And yeah, and just seeing the ways that you know, Black disabled people are so impacted by police violence. I think there's like Leroy, a lot of his work is around that, and I can't remember the number, but something like 70% of people who experience police violence are disabled. And it really feeds into like the anti-Black racism and the ableism are so combined in how people are perceived as like not complying and are automatically read as a threat, which is a very different experience from mine as a white disabled person. Like I'm not perceived as a threat. I'm perceived as like, oh no, like touch them with kid gloves kind of thing. Like, can you do that? Are you okay? That kind of thing is more along the lines of the kind of ableism that I receive. And so when we're in community with each other and we see these kinds of differences, then we can make more choices about how we are in alignment with each other, how we take up space, how we use our, you know, relative privileges in different kinds of spaces. Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to talking more about these distinctions momentarily, but I also want to rewind to one of my observations about your smile and associating that with happiness or with contentment. But I want to lift up some words that you've said, Nomy, that maybe what I'm observing is seeing you at a higher vibration. Maybe what I'm observing is seeing each of you in your wholeness, because no parts of you are being asked to be made invisible in this community. Perhaps, I don't know if either of you have reflections on that before we move forward. I see some lifting up. I see some praise hands. And I definitely see some smiles. And maybe we can move forward then, because something else that I heard, Nomy, you say was, in this opportunity to be in our wholeness, we are able to make choices. And I feel like that might be a transition into the 10 principles of disability justice and the choices that you all are collectively as a community able to make because of these principles. Would you both mind sharing a bit more about what the principles are and some concrete examples of what the framework looks like in practice? What types of choices are you making because of the 10 principles?
Yeah, so we can start off by just listing them off so that everyone is aware of what the 10 principles are. So intersectionality, leadership of those most impacted, anti-capitalist politics, commitment to cross-movement organizing, recognizing wholeness, which I think we've kind of briefly already touched on, sustainability, commitment to cross-disability solidarity, interdependence, collective access, and collective liberation.
Yeah, so then what it looks like in practice using these principles. I mean, the principles came out of practice and also of like decades-long movement work on the part of Patty Byrne and related communities and folks. And so, you know, this is like the hard-won wisdom that comes from that kind of work. And then it becomes a touchstone that we can refer back to. And it's like, okay, how are we practicing cross movement solidarity, for example? So in the past few years, Sins Invalid has been focusing more and more on climate chaos and the impacts of climate chaos on disabled people. And so like we had a show this past October called We Love Like Barnacles, holding on tight to our community. Crip Lives in Climate Chaos, that was the tagline. And so part of that is then building alliance with Movement Generation, who is focusing on climate chaos and labor. And you know, they've also been doing a lot of cross movement solidarity work. And so bringing like their team and our team together, and we have this like year-long study group that we meet every couple months. We read each other's work or related works from each other's movements and talk about what are the tensions here, what are the resonances like, and it's really exciting to think about what might come out of this collaboration, and we don't know yet because we're practicing, we're learning by being in community. Another example, you know, cross disability solidarity is like that we're not, so one of the things that we do at the beginning of any meeting or gathering is talk about our access needs and just share like, you know, oh, I'm going to be eating, or I'm going to need to like check out for a moment to check in with my attendant, or you know, the access needs are so many different things. It's also like, you know, my kid is at, you know, their group that they do, and I'm going to need to receive a call from them at some point. You know, there's just like, or, you know, how you said like, okay, kids are in the background, you know, just letting people know. Often they're not things that need anything from anyone else. It's just like, I'm just letting you know so that we can all be present together. But sometimes it is like, please keep your mouth uncovered while you're speaking because I'm reading lips, or you know, please don't have a whirring fan in the background because that could trigger a seizure. You know, lots of different things that also we do need to ask for from each other. And knowing that, and this goes into also collective access. So it's like, we don't have to just ask for and take responsibility for our own needs, that like we can work to meet each other's needs and know, you know, who's in the room and who's going to need what, and making sure that our events are as accessible as possible to as many people as possible. Yeah, and so you know, and it can be really fun. Sometimes we'll just do deep dives into different ones of the 10 principles. Be like, hey, let's really talk about sustainability. What does that look like? Sometimes that means that we cannot have the amount of output that we planned on or think we should. You know, okay, we're going to have a show, but a core person in the organization is dealing with major health issues. Guess what? We're not going to have a show because that person's life is more important, and we need to be sustainable in the way that we move. And that's actually, even though there's so much urgency in the world, like so much needs to happen, like the ability and the need to just slow down and let things unfold at a pace that is resonant with life is actually, that's also a part of anti-capitalism, you know, so they're all, you know, they're all connected, but these are just few examples of how we work with the principles.
And these are amazing examples. So just to recap a few, there's this opportunity to get really clear about who we are learning with, learning alongside, this notion of collaboration. I also heard that there's an invitation through the principles to be really clear about naming what it is we need to be fully present, but also how we can support each other in getting these needs met. And I love this opportunity to rethink time and the pace at which we are moving and producing, and how might that help us to rethink and reimagine how we show up in broader society. These are great. And I know there are so many more to be named. Actually, and we have a question from one of our participants that fits in with this conversation. Do you mind if I put it out there for you all to consider? So the attendee writes, my kiddo is queer, trans, and white, and has experienced both physical and mental health disabilities since birth. And this young person is also a childhood cancer survivor. And they also identify as an artist and now a young adult. So just a bit of context there. And the question is, now that we have this young adult, out in the world, what resources do you all have to support young people who may need support navigating the quote unquote working world, and support them in building community, as well as using their voice and choice for positive change and seeing themselves as their whole selves? And also, because we're talking about this in the context of the pandemic, are there virtual opportunities to do any and all of the above?
Do you have thoughts, Lettie?
I think it's such a complex question because I think disabled folks and like our relation to employability is like already such a complicated thing, because since we're not able to be productive members of a capitalistic society, we are seen as like inherently having less worth than an able-bodied person. And so navigating the working world is something that I think is, yeah, I don't think I have any solid advice beside, yeah, I'm sorry.
I mean, that's just so real, Lettie. And I feel like there are a lot of resources out there, like independent living centers, where they're staffed by people with disabilities, and they're tapped into the resources that are available for job training and that kind of stuff. And I've gone through that kind of stuff too. And I feel like what Sins is more able to support with is be like, fuck capitalism, I don't have to work to be valuable, and what I'm doing right now is work, even if I'm not going to get paid for it. So that's more of our framework, and what we're able to like really get behind you with. Not to say like you shouldn't work, you can, that's great. Sins resources, we have really active social media. We have a newsletter. We do hold events sometimes, like when the pandemic first started, we had a couple dance parties that were really fun on Zoom, and hope to have some of those again. We do this cultural programming, we do performances. There's a lot of material available on our website, so please just like dive into the website and see. I think sometimes just like seeing a picture of disabled performers looking like so fantastic on stage can like open up realities for people, like, oh, I didn't know that disabled people could do that or look like that or be seen that way. And, you know, we also share a lot of information on our Facebook page and Instagram and stuff that is connected to other disabled folks and disabled organizing. So I think there's a lot of online resources for community building. There's like a Sick and Disabled Queers Facebook group. Yeah, those are the things that come to mind.
Thank you for lifting up the complexity of the question and also on the fly coming up with these amazing resources that you have as well. All of it is so appreciated. And I just want to double down on, yes, this is work. This right here, just as it is work. Maybe just a breath.
Yeah, I was just going to say breathing is work.
Yeah. Necessary work. Life-giving work.
Sometimes pleasurable work.
Yes. I like this invitation to reframe work in these moments with the two of you. Thank you. You know, in thinking about the principles, there's a way that they embody so many opportunities for how we as human beings can live. And some might want to put labels on it and call it the 10 principles of disability justice. I also look at them and think, well, these are 10 principles of anti-racism. These are 10 principles that help us to coexist as humans, just period, flat out. How has the leadership of Sins Invalid over time shifted and shaped the principles? And I want to acknowledge Patty, the co-founder of Sins Invalid's deep work in this body of excellence here that is now shared with the world, and how over time, Patty and beyond, how have these principles shifted and shaped over time, and maybe shifted and shaped you individually, if I can grow that question a bit more.
So Sins Invalid was created by Black and Brown people to serve and center Black and Brown individuals. And over time, I think the core message has remained the same. These principles have always been the guiding force for all of Sins's work. And while some individuals have, they come and go, but they're still part of the Sins Invalid community. And so they continue to influence all of the work that we do, and they will forever be a part of what makes Sins Invalid. And I think it's important to note that right now we do have our staff is small, and so the majority of us are people of color, but we do have 2 white staff members, and the people of color who are part of the organization, we are light-skinned. And I think it's important to kind of acknowledge this fact because of the broader phenomenon of colorism within all levels of society, and just the way that it impacts us as an organization as well. And even with these principles, like we're not perfect, and we're working to make our work more accessible, and we are constantly working to make our work more accessible to different communities and to bring in different communities who may who may see themselves not represented within our work. And so right now we're working on translating our 10 principles of disability justice into American Sign Language, which I think is something that is often overlooked because of autism and people just assuming that English and ASL are the same thing. And there's just so much complexity in giving people material that they can engage with in this way, if that makes sense. And so right now we're just working to expand the reach of our work and who our 10 disability justice principles can be accessed by. So those are some of the things that we've been shifting.
Yeah, and I think, that's such an important point, Lettie. Just, I think there have been deaf individuals involved with Sins Invalid since the beginning, and not in the core organizing staff. And so that's also been something that we've been working to develop more competency with ASL within the core staff, which, in disability community can be complicated for multiple reasons. One of which is like, not everyone has mobility of their hands. And so, we're looking at the ways that trying to learn ASL can bring up internalized ableism for folks. And then also the ways that like our framing of ableism is not totally inclusive of deaf communities. And so, we might think it is, but deaf folks might be like, that doesn't resonate for me. So we're learning about that. And another place that we're working on expanding with the 10 principles is around, youth or people with intellectual disabilities or neurodivergent people who maybe don't like have as like linear of a brain to be like, what do you like, big word definition, so we're working on creating a bit more like accessible language, 10 principles. And there was a teacher who works with like young, I think maybe middle school or high school aged folks with intellectual disabilities, and she had done her own translation of our principles into language that she could teach her students. And we looked at it and we were like, that's a really great idea. It doesn't totally capture it. And so now we're kind of working with what she created and reworking it and moving towards putting it out. And it's really, it'll be like some of the language that she said, like, trying to simplify to be like, sometimes people are hurt in these ways, right? But then in conversations, we're like, well, we're not necessarily talking about being hurt. We're talking about oppression, which is more complex than just hurt. And so how do we name that and not lose the significance of that while making it make sense to folks on just like a very personal kind of like bodily level. So yeah, so that's some of the work around the principles. And all of these can kind of go back to different principles around cross disability solidarity, cross movement solidarity, intersectionality. And I guess one more thing I wanted to say, I don't know how many people have worked with the norms of white supremacy culture. Tema Okun is one of the people that kind of created this document that lists these things that come up in communities, and it doesn't even have, in organizing, it doesn't even just have to be white folks, because so many of us like have internalized these ways of being that have to do with like, it's like perfectionism, urgency, there's only one right way to do things, like worship of the written word. And so we, within Sins, there's like a white caucus that'll meet sometimes. It's often like me and some of our interns, for example, and we've gone through and kind of talked through each of those norms of white supremacy culture. And in so many ways, the 10 principles are kind of like the antidote to those things. So that's been interesting to play with and learn from too.
Mm. Lots of head nodding going on my end, and I'm taking down notes too. There's this way that as I'm listening and learning, you are making concepts that have for far too long been merged together and unanalyzed. You have this way, I'm for those who are not using sight, my fingers right now are overlapping, and I am only through this act able to put in to articulate what I can't quite put into words. There's a way that Sins Invalid helps to disaggregate and make known all of the parts of us in these very beautiful and intentional ways. And I'm so appreciative of your work here. And I hope that more people through today are able to connect with you all to learn about the 10 principles and the ways that you are showing up and embodying them in all that you do. It's such important work. And I would love to talk a bit more, Lettie, you referenced earlier that there are ways that colorism impacts the work that you all do and the spaces that you inhabit and the way that you are received as a result. Specifically, would love to talk more about how, as light-skinned presenting to me, I'm just going to speak for myself, to me, as light-skinned presenting individuals, how you are showing up within your community to recognize the need to, and actually demonstrate this need to call in white disability communities. It is a part of your work, and it's referenced in principle number 4, challenging white disability communities around racism and challenging other movements to confront ableism to create a united front. How are you all doing this? What does this look like in practice, and what lessons can our audience take from this as well?
I think one of the first steps is acknowledging that even if you are a person of color, it's important to acknowledge that colorism is a thing that impacts us within our communities and also broadly within society. And the way that colorism can impact our opportunities for work, our opportunities for life in general. And within Sins Invalid, we are very consciously working to analyze the like us as light-skinned individuals and be very deliberate in the way that we bring in like darker skinned folks into the organization. I don't think it's enough to like bring in darker skinned folks into a space that hasn't analyzed its own internal structures and like the ways that it interacts with darker skin communities. It's just not fair for spaces to like bring in darker skin folks without having already done some of that internal work, because that just creates a lot of emotional labor on for darker skinned folks. Like, it's not their job to kind of call us out on like the fact that we may be playing into colorism. It is like our own personal responsibility as an organization to recognize that, oh, this is happening. Like, what do we do to undo it? Like, we have to be very, very deliberate in the way that we kind of unpack it and acknowledge it and deal with it, because just acknowledging it, it's the first step, but then we have to like take concrete steps into actually fixing something like that, because I think being anti-racist is you have to be very deliberate in everything you do. You can't just passively kind of expect things to happen. And so those are my thoughts on that.
I think for myself, around that conversation around colorism in POC communities, it feels like an honor for me to witness that conversation and to like help to hold that. And it also feels like almost not my business exactly. Like as a white person, I'm working on the part of myself and then with other white people to reduce the harms of white normativity, white entitlement. And so, and then through that to support this like internal work that Lettie is talking about doing. And I think, you know, the quote that you shared about challenging white disability communities around racism and then challenging other movements to confront ableism to create a united front. I think there's just been so much, I think the word people will use sometimes is siloing of like, this is like disability related, this is race related. And that, you know, I hear from folks of color that like in their communities that they're like, that disability isn't being held as like central or important. And then I have witnessed in white disability communities that it's as if like if you've experienced one kind of oppression, you think you understand all kinds of oppression, and that's just not true. They all operate and function differently, and we can both be disabled, experiencing ableism, and also being racist, and enforcing white supremacy in our own disabled communities. So one thing that we mentioned, you know, I can't remember if we mentioned it during this or in the pre-conversation, but just that like independence has been such a focus of the disability rights movement. And it's very important to like not to downplay that, because that's the reason that you know, people are able to live outside of institutions and have in-home attendant care and have legal protections around employment, etc. Also, the focus on independence can negate the kinds of like familial and community structures and supports that are a part of so many communities of color and immigrant communities, etc. And so sometimes when we're fighting for these like what's set up in white disability community as the end all be all, that can work against the needs and desires of disabled people of color sometimes. And so yeah, just like Lettie said, like this is work that we have to constantly be looking at, thinking through, undoing in ourselves in order to be better allies and accomplices to each other.
Just a quick clarifying question from the audience. To what extent is your executive staff currently primarily comprised of Black and Indigenous people of color? And I guess that would extend beyond immediate staff, but also your board or advisory groups, etc.
So we're a fiscally sponsored project, so we don't have a board. We have kind of like a network that includes the core staff, performers, folks that have worked with us in the past. So it can be hard to assess, but currently, so Patty Byrne, who's the founder, she's Japanese and Haitian. I'm white and Jewish, and so is Mordecai, who is the development director. And then our other two staff are Lettie and Karina, and I'll let you speak for yourself, Lettie.
Yeah, so Karina is Latina and I am Latina. So it is three out of 5 of our core staff, because we do work with outside members of the community and we do contract, but 3 out of 5 are people of color and 2 are white folks. And yeah, it's very important. But as I've mentioned before, it's important to note that even the people of color within our organization are light-skinned. And I think that colorism is just such a thing that doesn't get talked about. And it's like becoming a thing that we need to talk about, because we can't just be bringing in one specific type of person of color that is deemed kind of acceptable by general society, because we see it in media, we see it reflected in our communities. People who are light-skinned get opportunities and access to resources that darker skinned folks just don't. And it's something that we as an organization are really working and kind of brainstorming around, and like, how do we address this within the organization? How do we challenge the white cultural norms within our organization? And that is something that we are very currently working on. And we're trying to center dark-skinned people of color, because it's important to recognize that their lived experience is just so different from people who are lighter skinned, because unfortunately in the current hierarchical system, proximity to whiteness gives you access to these resources that aren't available to our darker skinned brethren and siblings. Yeah. And just to say, like, I'm talking about colorism, but honestly, like, you should be listening to like dark-skinned people about like topics like this, because I have my privilege, and honestly, I can only say so much about the experiences of darker skinned folks. Like, you should be listening to them. You should be also centering them in your narratives.
I have no question here because you have said what needs to be said. I'm just allowing the silence to do what the silence can magically do. The beauty of silence. And possibly a 7-year-old that is off camera who you may hear in the background. Also, just want to share that a few thoughts have come up in the chat from our audience today. And one in particular is a question regarding space needs and potentially an invitation. So I want to ensure that you see this one and maybe follow up as you see fit. The question here is, what would you ideally expect and hope for from a venue that would host your organization if you were using a new space or in a new collaboration? This particular participant says that we are opening a new venue. and are eagerly anticipating working with a similar company project to yours, and we want it to be a safe place for all. Any thoughts on that you'd like to share?
Yes. One of the first things that comes to mind is really taking steps to have it be a scent-free, fragrance-free space. Making sure that there's not mold contamination. These are things that are like invisible that impact so many members of our community and just literally make it so people can't be in a space. So having a policy both around like cleaning products and then also like folks that come into the space, like a really clear policy around being scent free. And then obviously, ramps. And, if you're having like a event space with a stage, make the stage accessible. It's amazing how many spaces, like the space is accessible, but the stage isn't. So like the assumption that there won't be any disabled people on the stage. Yeah, those are the top things that come up for me.
I think I'd just add that it's so important to be like very adaptable and willing to make your space accessible, because every individual has very different accessibility needs and they can change from day to day, from hour to hour. And it's just very important that you create a space where people feel comfortable expressing their accessibility needs, because I think that's one of the barriers that people don't talk about, because a lot of the times it disabled people might feel uncomfortable expressing their needs because of the way it may potentially impact them. And yeah, so I think creating a space where people can, where it's like normal, where it's normalized to be like, hey, I need this. Hey, I need this. And you can just do check-ins over time, the beginning of your meeting, middle of your meeting. But yeah, those are just some things that come to mind for me.
I thought of a couple more specific things that I want to mention. So a variety of seating options, some like sturdy chairs that don't have arms for fat people, maybe other sturdy chairs with arms for folks who need that to be able to like push up to get up. Yeah, lots, and then like comfy spaces for people that need to be able to rest throughout their time, like so variety of seating options. I know that like the cheapest chairs are like the like flimsy ones, and those are the ones that are often in public spaces, and they're dangerous. So, and then the other thing is like variety of lighting options and steering away from fluorescent lights and having, multiple lamps in a space so you can try things out and be like, oh, does this work for folks? Some people need more lighting, some people need less lighting. But when all you have is like the overhead fluorescent, it's often doesn't work for a lot of people.
Thank you for these, again, impromptu responses that you've given to the question that was asked. Really appreciate the depth of your knowledge. And again, the way that you've held this conversation, which is a complex conversation, doesn't mean it's impossible to have, but you have held this conversation with such grace. And the real life stories that you bring to it, you bring it all to life in a way that we can apply moving forward. I will be taking from this many things. I will be listening to Centering the Experiences of Dark-Skinned People. I will be saying regularly, my accessibility needs have been met as a way of normalizing our opportunity to do this. I will be asking, what my colleagues' accessibility needs are. And I will absolutely be purchasing the book that goes into detail on the 10 principles of disability justice. I will absolutely be doing that and encourage everyone who's listening to do so as well. Nomy and Lettie, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.